and these kinds of Yes. Okay, everyone, welcome back after the coffee. Welcome back. This is the final leg of our time together. We've got 3 presentations and a panel discussion, hence the many chairs you can see by my side. First of all, a change to the program. We were hoping to have John Holden from Atom Bank with us. He's come down with COVID. He sends his apologies, and I think we all send him our best wishes. He promises to be with us this time next year, so look forward to that and hope, John, you get well soon. We have a ready-made replacement. Delighted to say we have a virtual presentation from Tim Mackey, Principal Security Strategist at Synopsys Cyber Security Research Center. He's going to talk about supply chain, the software supply chain, the challenges, the risks, and mitigation strategies for attacks. So I'll leave you in Tim's capable hands.
And welcome to today's session, Understanding Software Supply Chains. We're going to take an in-depth look at the challenges, risks, and mitigation strategies to better prepare you against cyber attacks. My name is Tim Mackey, and I'm Principal Security Strategist over here at the Synopsys Cybersecurity Research Center. I do want to be kind of upfront with everyone. The focus of this session is to expose some of the complexities of modern software development. It is going to be a little bit technical. The goal is to provide an understanding of the risk factors and attributes used to identify software risk and not really to recommend any particular products. Of course, obviously Synopsys has some products in our portfolio that will be useful in mitigating risk within software supply chains, but that's not the goal of this particular session. To kind of give a little bit of a level set, a modern application is built up of some amount of customer proprietary code, an ever-increasing quantity of open source components. Our most recent OSRA report, Open Source Security and Risk Analysis report, had upwards of 70% of code in commercial software code bases coming from open source origin, so it's an ever-increasing component of most open source, of most applications rather. Some API usage, and of course the inevitable configuration and behavioral settings for that particular stack. Now, while there is that application, when you peel back the onion a little bit, what you find is that there's no single application. You end up with something that looks a little bit more like the architecture diagram that's up on the screen where, let's say, for example, we wanted to go and create a new IoT device. That IoT device is going to have a whole series of dependencies, and those dependencies are going to be written in their own languages. So the IoT device code's probably written in C++. It's going to have a processor-specific framework. It's going to have some commercial libraries and some open source libraries in there. It's likely to be configured from a mobile application, which is going to be written in Kotlin or Java or Objective-C. Again, some libraries in there. There's going to be a centralized analysis engine that's probably cloud-based, and that's going to be written in a modern language like, say, Golang or Rust or PHP. Then there's a web UI, which is going to be likely a responsive one written in HTML5. Lots of API-driven data sources that are going to tie back into the analysis engine. And lastly, while everything outside of the world of the IoT device can participate in more of a DevOps kind of continuous delivery paradigm, the actual device itself, it needs a framework to support that, and that's the over-the-air update, which is going to effectively give trusted web delivery of that IoT firmware. That's what an application looks like when you peel back everything. You have a whole series of micro applications that are powering it, not necessarily microservices, but it's a very distributed systems view of the world. So I'm actually going to go and look at things through a little bit of a simpler lens. Let's go and explore what a supply chain looks like in the context of software. For this, I'm going to say create a simple Slack application. It's got an interface to Instagram, and I'm going to write it in a language called Node.js, so very JavaScript. In order to make this work, I have 8 declared suppliers. These are the dependencies that have been configured in the system. One of those is a library that comes from Slack that is designed to facilitate the development of Slack applications. This particular thing is called Bolt, and it has 15 dependencies. So I personally have declared 8. Those are the ones that I'm actively managing, and one of these has an additional 15 dependencies in it. Those dependencies, they're on the screen right now. One of them is called Express. Express is one level down. It is another set of libraries, and it itself has 30 dependencies associated with it. If you walk that entire tree, what you end up with is that Slack Bolt itself has 133 unique components in its dependency tree, going down to a level of 8, which means that that simple declaration of Slack Bolt for the application brings in another 133 components. Now, this gets very interesting when you look at some of those components. One of the more interesting ones being the distinction between something called safe buffer and something called safer buffer, and we'll get into that in just a second. Now, supply chain security risks really differ from proprietary software. One of the key elements being the supply chain attacks aren't necessarily disclosed using CVEs. Most recently, there was something called Trojan Source, the latest incarnation of a set of attacks on development practices and the trust factors involved in them. And it isn't going to be disclosed in a CVE. You have things where malicious code is being added into components, not in a CVE. Typo squatting, not in a CVE. Origin confusion, not in a CVE. Dependency confusion, not in a CVE. Fork mismanagement, all of these things are not in CVEs. So those types of tooling that are giving you the information around vulnerability disclosures aren't necessarily the things that you're going to maximize in terms of being able to have information flow into your organization. But it's not just a CVE disclosure problem, it's also a scale problem. So in our OSRA report earlier this year, we found that the average commercial code base contained 528 components. So think about it for a second. If you designed your entire process several years ago to go and have maybe 100 to 200 components per application, we're now well over 500 components per application. Are your processes designed to manage 500 or more components per application? Are your processes designed to handle close to 50 new CVEs per day, which was the average number from 2020? It's no surprise that with this scale problem that when we surveyed over 1,300 organizations last year as part of a DevSecOps practices and open source management survey, that 3/4 of the organizations indicated that it took them longer than a week to resolve high severity vulnerabilities. That's kind of the scale of the problem. But let's dig in just a little bit. So, software supply chains are complex entities. I showed you before just going down Slack Bolt a little bit, but let's go through some of the mechanisms that are necessary in order to select a correct component. So starting out, what is the name of the component? So I'm in NPM here. I've typed in validate email to the search. I've returned 151 packages. Which one is going to be the correct validation script? That's kind of something I need to investigate. If I do the same thing within PyPy, which is the Python package manager, I get over 10,000 projects. That's something that is, well, a function of how their search engine works. But I have two components that have exactly the same description. Validate underscore email verifies if an email address is valid and really exists. I have one from March of 2015 called validate underscore email 1.3. I have another one from February of 2020 that is validate hyphen email hyphen WT 1.4.6. Which one of these is correct isn't necessarily the most recent one. There could be patches. There could be additional functionality that is distinguishing these two components. Investigation is necessary. Now, of course, when you get to the concept of meta repositories like, say, Docker Hub, you can have the same resource from multiple sources and have it be equally popular. And so in this instance, it's email-resource, available from two sources, one that was updated most recently 9 months ago, another that's almost 4 years old. The one that's updated 9 months ago, that might be the quote correct one for no other reason than it's most recent, so it should be patched more, but maybe it contains functionality like, say, a crypto mine. You wouldn't know without actually investigating. Now, I mentioned earlier about safe buffer versus safer buffer rather. The core challenge with this is you need to understand the functionality. So both of these components are very popular. Safer buffer has over 24 million downloads last week. Safe buffer has almost 54 million. Safer buffer was last updated 3 years ago. Safe buffer a year ago. Safe buffer makes a security statement explaining why buffer is unsafe and essentially says that the API is optimized for convenience. You can throw any type at it and it will figure things out. So you end up with a lot of two elements in the code conversion. Safer buffer actually goes one step further and says, well, why not just use safe buffer? And comes to the conclusion that when they analyzed the ecosystem, they found that the old buffer API and had issues with safe buffer that itself was causing problems. So this, of course, becomes part of the challenge. And then, well, there's somebody's private fork of the code. So these represent core challenges that a review cycle needs to have in order to function properly. Now, of course, the component origin is part of the problem that you need to be looking at. So take OpenSSL as an example. The upstream project is OpenSSL. They use a private Git repository that is then mirrored into GitHub. And many forks or branches of that code exist. Some are major distributions like, say, from Fedora or Debian or CentOS. Some are forks of forks, LibreSSL being a pretty good example of that. Some come from API bindings like what you would find with Node or Python, and others are meta repositories where a binary has been compiled and is distributed directly. Docker Hub is a perfect example of that. Now, the engagement model is very important because with forks, well, OpenSSL has close to 7,000 forks. There's 7,000 branches to the code. And some updates are relatively active. So there's a null pointer dereference fix that was found as a result of running Coverity, a Synopsys static analysis tool, and the fix was put in place 4 hours ago. There are over 1,000 issues and over 200 outstanding pull requests or updates to be processed. This is a pretty active project. Now, OpenSSL is kind of interesting because every single device out there likely has a version of OpenSSL that is being used. So very easily, I have well over a dozen different versions of OpenSSL powering my life, from my phone to my DVRs to my TVs to my thermostats to my laptop, all with different versions of OpenSSL. Now, one other problem is looking at how project end of life works. So there's a component called request, And request is in a maintenance mode. If you look at it, it's the lovely deprecated statement on it that essentially says, as of the 11th of February, well, this is now a fully deprecated environment. But in their maintenance mode statement, they state that the committers are still active and will try to merge fixes in a timely fashion, but they're not making any promises. Releases will be fully automated and a merge into master will be published. We're going to have to remove inactive collaborators and enforce 2FA because commit rights will effectively become publish rights. That's a scary statement, that you could have an automatic publish capability, made scarier still by the fact that there are 52,000 projects that depend upon request. So now the fork scenario plays into this. So we have, with requests, over 3,000 forks. There are 30 outstanding pull requests. And remember, as of the 11th of February, 2020, everything was deprecated. There are 4 forks that happened over roughly the last year, one in May, one in March, one from December of last year, and one from October of last year. And if you look at the network graph, you will see only one of those from the contributor VRS Brazil is actually represented inside that network graph. Now, because these are pull requests, the authors haven't necessarily seen the deprecation statement and are actually trying to contribute the code back. Now, some consumers of this code recognize that, well, they're going to have to take ownership. Postman Labs is one of those. So in this case, it is a fork from request. That is the origin. And they don't necessarily have the same review cycles in place. So in this case, the Postman Labs version of request is actually 354 commits ahead of the request component itself. So in other words, there have been 354 changes in the code since this branch was created. Now, some of those are very important. So the README for Postman's version says that it's a fork of a request module, being very upfront, contains a few bug fixes that are not contained in request. So things like redirect behavior, fixing content length headers, exception handling for large form data. All of these things are issues that they have fixed that were not part of the original request object. So now when we come to a supply chain attack, what we're really looking at is a question of trust and the exploitation of trust. So do developers have good intentions? Yes, we assume that, but that's an exploitable thing. Similarly, we're assuming that credentials are secure. We're assuming that the code being built always originates from a source code management system and wasn't put in place by someone who could, for example, go and copy files to a build system. That any cached code coming from public repositories matches the approvals that were put in place, that only approved cached libraries are being used, and obviously that the build system is in fact secured, and lastly that the output of this entire operation is in fact only validated artifacts that can be used later. If we then look at the packaging of that fictitious application and base it on, say, a containerized model, there's still trust boundaries that are being exploited. So does the container build actually reference the correct artifact? Are hardened images used in the registry? Is the build surface itself secured and untainted? So in other words, could there be a former build artifact in place that could be used? Are abstract tags used, the human readable tags used to reference the validated image, or is it a fully qualified pull spec? And again, fully qualified pull specs matter when you're pulling the images into Kubernetes itself to make certain that you have the correct version of everything. Now, when you look at the approval cycle, you have to look at the vetting process. So most open source ends up being brought into an organization as a free download. Someone found it, brought it in, the world's happy, everybody likes it. If you compare that to the commercial procurement model, there's a procurement checklist that goes through before things are brought in. Mature open source organizations will do the same thing and have a variation of that commercial model but used in place for open source, whereas, for example, security reviews, licensing reviews, and compliance checklists. The developer is going to be responsible for the woohoo, I'm downloading it straight path. The developer is simply consuming something that went through commercial procurement, and the developer is both consuming and vetting the components into the organization. So that changes the threat models. And so these threat models are all looking at how you can have an attack on, for example, the procurement process. Do you, for example, have any components that you don't know the explicit origin of? Can you describe the vetting process that was used for each component, and so on? And then there's attacks on the update and development workflows. Do you depend upon any components that originate from a default source? Do you know how component updates are communicated? What is the window of opportunity between update and being able to declare complete patch? Do you review the update for undesired functional changes? Because in a lot of organizations, all of that upfront review process that occurs, that's something that is lost when the update cycle comes along. And effectively, if someone is in a position to go and compromise one of the upstream repositories, whether it's a supplier's or a public repository, and pollute it with malicious code, there's now almost an unfettered entry point into the organization because of the lack of review process. So ultimately, the question becomes, what can a team do to reduce supply chain risk? So earlier this year, in May, U.S. President Biden issued an executive order numbered 14028 that basically was talking about software supply chains. So you know when the U.S. President is issuing an order that there is a serious problem to be had. SolarWinds, Colonial pipeline, and many, many other scenarios were what prompted this. And it has a very structured timeline associated with the activities. Now, the president doesn't have the ability to go and say, thou shalt spend money on this, but does have the ability to direct agencies like NIST to go and perform certain activities like define critical software, identify mechanisms to attribute software bills of material, and so forth. We're now in November, as I'm recording this. There's a whole series of activities that are yet to happen. November 8th being the first one that's closest to this recording date. And that's to publish a set of preliminary guidelines around what software supply chain security looks like. But there's a whole series of additional activities that will occur through 2022, ending with some acquisition regulation changes for federal acquisitions within the U.S., meaning suppliers will need to care about this. Now, that gives us a checklist for supply chain reviews that go back to the origin of the component, how are updates communicated, why was the component selected relative to others, what capabilities are in the component, what security reviews were done in approval, what security reviews were being done on updates prior to adoption. A nice long list of items on the checklist itself that fundamentally feed into a set of policies. So if we look at a canonical scenario of how things would be deployed, we have a situation where we should be vetting policy to make certain that our libraries and frameworks are being used according to policy. That we only package things from the build service if the policies are met. That if we're, say, building a containerized application, we're hardening based on industry standards. And then when the time comes to go and build the container image, we are pulling the base image if the policy is still met. After the build, we're pushing it into the registry if the policies are met. And lastly, because there could be a set of distances in time between when the policy was assessed originally and when the component, in this case a container image, was actually used, we re-verify at admission into the Kubernetes cluster. And lastly, of course, there are a whole series of regulatory requirements and governance changes that could be put in place that should trigger a review of the policy. Now, I know that we've had a very short time for the session. There's a lot of material that goes into software supply chains. It's a very complex field today. I would be very happy to engage with any of the audience on this as we move forward. And I wish you an opportunity to go to our booth or to contact Synopsys to learn more about software supply chain security. Thank you.
We are still applauding virtual contributions. Tim, thanks very much indeed for that. I hope you all were concentrating. There's a quick test coming soon on all of that. Let's move on. I'm joking, of course, about the test. Let's talk about ransomware. We talked about it yesterday. I love the title here, Where Does It End? Does it end? Feels like another question worth asking. Chris Morgan is Senior Cyber Threat Intelligence Analyst at Digital Shadows. He's going to be in your company for the next 10 minutes or so. Chris, please.
First of all, good morning, and thank you all for inviting me to speak with you all today about this very relevant topic, and I think everyone's favorite topic really, which of course is ransomware. I'm Chris Morgan, and I'm a Senior Cyber Threat Intelligence Analyst at Digital Shadows, who are a leader in digital risk protection and tracking and providing assessment on the various cyber extortion actors, including ransomware, who are in existence today, is one of the key things we do to protect our clients. On today's agenda, we'll be covering the state of ransomware in 2021. We'll discuss the use of ransomware as a service programs, initial access brokers, and the double extortion technique and what influence they've had on the ransomware landscape. And we'll ponder what is the future for ransomware in 2022. So I probably don't need to go into too much details on exactly what ransomware is. I'm sure you all have a very good understanding of this. But this is one of the biggest threats and highest trending attack vectors impacting companies today, involving the deliberate encryption of sensitive data and services in order to solicit a ransom fee, which is often in the range of hundreds of thousands of dollars to potentially tens of millions. Overall, the numbers of attacks and impact have both demonstrably increased in the last couple of years. At a high level, though, the ability of threat actors to identify susceptible networks and susceptible companies is increasing, whilst the costs and the skills required to actually go out and conduct an attack is decreasing. And this has resulted in a really highly saturated market of dozens of different groups all committing attacks every single week. And recent reporting has actually suggested that up to 80% of companies impacted by this type of activity actually pay a ransom fee, which is a really shocking statistic and something that indicates just how out of hand this problem has got. So on slide right now, you can see some of the press releases from some of the biggest attacks from the past year. So the Colonial pipeline attack conducted by the DarkSide group that really caused havoc on the US East Coast with their fuel supply. You can see the supply chain / ransomware attack that was conducted by Revil against software supplier Kaseya that really left a lot of managed service providers in a bad state. And the Conti attack against Ireland's healthcare industry. So Digital Shadows currently track 38 distinct ransomware data leak sites, which really fluctuates on a weekly basis. So this is potentially out of date from the time I put this slide together last week. And there's a number of reasons why this happens. A lot of new groups emerge, older groups disband or rebrand with a different name. There are a number of reasons why this happens. So for example, in the last year, the DarkSide group that I just mentioned, they were widely suspected as rebranding to the Black Matter ransomware, which followed a huge amount of scrutiny that they received in the aftermath of the attack against Colonial Pipeline, not just from media and from law enforcement, but also from other members of the cybercriminal community. I think this was largely because other cybercriminals felt that by attacking critical national infrastructure, they were bringing undue pressure and undue attention to wider ransomware actors. And this happens quite often. A group will conduct an attack, potentially not understand the implications of what they're doing or who they're going after. They'll then close up shop and go underground for a period, almost in an attempt to escape the attention of law enforcement. We've seen this with so many different cases. So you can see on screen right now, Ryuk, this was a really active group in 2020, and they've rebranded to Conti. You have the GAN Crab malware that you may have heard of, and they've rebranded to Revil Sodanikibi. And I'd like to take this time to discuss, a few minutes around the factors that really have turned ransomware from a small and mostly opportunistic threat, basically impacting kind of individual laptops for a small fee, all the way to 2021, where we're having enterprise networks deliberately targeted in order to produce these massive ransom fees. And the first thing to mention is the wide adoption of ransomware as a service programs, which is a business model that's used by numerous ransomware developers where they lease their ransomware variants, much in the same way that a legitimate software supplier might lease their software products. And basically, ransomware as a service programs give every actor, no matter how unskilled they might be, the ability to actually go and launch a ransomware attack. The price of a ransomware as a service kit ranges from around $40 to potentially, a few thousands per month. But overall, this is a really trivial amount considering the price that a ransomware extortion fee can actually result in. And just to mention that on average, these affiliates receive around 70 to 80% of the fee that they can actually receive from an attack. So, a pretty hefty chunk of change considering that many of these groups or many of these actors will be on the lower end of the spectrum when considering the cybercriminal hierarchy. So moving on to initial access brokers. You may have come across this term before. These are actors who do the technical dirty work by providing ransomware operators with a wealth of victims to compromise. This is a real symbol of cybercrime professionalization, and they essentially find vulnerable networks, they find vulnerable companies, and then they sell those accesses on for a set price on dedicated dark web forums. And the rise in popularity of these types of actors, again, really follows the trend of a lowered barrier of entry to actually entering the world of cybercrime. So you can see on screen right now, this is a fairly typical initial access broker listing. It's fairly light in what they detail. You'll have a geography, you'll have what type of access they're providing, a revenue, what the business is actually involved in. And this is done intentionally to try and avoid unnecessary exposure from both cybersecurity researchers and law enforcement. What you can see on screen right now is the top 5 access types that were listed during Q3 2021 as per our research, and the average prices that these accesses are being sold for. So the really obvious ones to call out, virtual private network accesses were among the top 3 accesses listed in cybercriminal forums, which is likely influenced by the introduction of remote working models. And Digital Shadows observed that the average price for VPN was around $3,000, which again is is a fairly low price for what they're doing. And also to call out remote desktop protocol, this is a really big problem amongst ransomware attacks. And just to highlight the enormous risk that's posed by these listings, they'll typically go after RDP. They're exposed on a common port. They'll try and brute force some credentials, and then when they've sold this onto a various cybercriminal, which often is ransomware related, they can really kickstart and accelerate that kill chain by moving past reconnaissance and the initial access and start on your network. And I can't emphasize enough, if your RDP or your VPN are secured in an insecure manner, if they're not patched, if they have weak credentials, if they don't have 2FA, if they're exposed on common ports, then you really need to square this away as soon as you can, because this is one of the most common methods that these actors are actually getting onto networks. And the last technique I'd like to really touch upon is the use of double extortion, which is really a significant turning point in the evolution of what ransomware attacks are. This involves the deliberate exfiltration of sensitive data, which is added as an additional incentive for organizations to pay up. These groups will threaten to post the stolen data onto dedicated data leak sites, which are hosted on the dark web, and this significantly increases the risk associated with a ransomware-based intrusion. So now companies not only have to deal with their data and their services being encrypted and the obvious outages that come with that, but they now have a data breach with all the regulatory, financial, and the reputational risks that embodies. So you can see on screen right now an example of some of the data leak sites that we track, and this is typically how we monitor how active these groups are. Again, very, very limited on details of what they supply, but it typically has they name the victim, they name who they've targeted, they have a description of what they've stolen and a kind of a snapshot of what they've done as proof, and then a counter timer specifying the time frame in which the victim must pay up. And pretty much every major ransomware group are now operating these data leak sites in this manner. And I think that what the big problem with this is, many companies can have, robust backups, or at least they're improving their backups, which can deal with the data encryption side of an attack. But with double extortion, there's really only a limited amount you can do if these actors have successfully exfiltrated this data. It's hosted on parts of the internet which you can't do a great deal about taking it down. And this is definitely something that's here to stay, because it's significantly improving the chances of a ransomware group actually receiving a fee. So where does this end? Well, unfortunately, the predictable and bad news is that ransomware activity is almost certainly here to stay, in the medium to short term at least. And I think a big reason for this is the lack of ability for international law enforcement to actually provide meaningful prosecution against enough of these actors to really have an impact on the overall ransomware landscape. Many of these actors are based in either Russia or the Russian-speaking sphere of the world, many in former CIS states, so the former Soviet Union. And I think the general consensus is that law enforcement in these countries is either incapable or they're unwilling to tackle this activity. So what can actually be done? Well, legislative changes can make a real impact on this. So we heard from the last speaker the recent executive order that was issued by President Biden in May of 2021. This has a number of really good initiatives, like pushing companies towards zero trust, the mandation of two-factor authentication for companies that are working with the federal government. And that can go a really long way in improving the likelihood of a company actually being impacted by this type of activity. We've also seen recent suggestions that the US government are going to crack down on the cryptocurrency trade, although I think that the details on that are a little bit unclear at this stage. And it should be stated that targeting the money side of the ransomware operation really might be the best place for law enforcement to actually make changes. So a recent report by ENISA highlighted that only a small handful of money launderers actually control the operation of taking a ransom fee and cleaning that to useful currency for these ransomware groups. So if international law enforcement can make arrests against these handful of money launderers, they can generate leads, then that might be the best method of taking down several of these groups at one time. So that brings me to what I'd like to present today, and I invite any questions that you might have.
Chris, thank you very much. One question from me on one of your slides. 70 to 80% of the profits go to the authors, 20 to 30% go to the distributors. Should we be going after those distributors in order to sort of cut the cord between the authors and the victims, or is that being slightly naive?
I think, to be honest with you, if they can bring arrests against any of these individuals, it's going to be a good result. Recently, there was charges brought against the leadership within the dark side operation, which I think would have the greatest impact in kind of taking down that particular group. But often the leadership of these particular groups, as I say, they're based in parts of the world where international law enforcement only has so much legislation, and they only have so much ability to tackle these guys and to bring them down. So ideally, you would go straight to the top and cut the head off the snake, but unfortunately, it doesn't always seem to be that easy.
And any positive signs?
Yes. So recent operations have, like I say, have brought a number of arrests. There's been ransom fees that have been retrieved by US authorities. That was associated with, I believe, the Revel group. So if that can be turned into a regular playbook where they're able to take back money that's paid to these ransomware groups, then that could be something that authorities might do.
Very good. Chris, thank you once again. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay, we have two more sessions. We have a virtual session coming up and then followed by a panel. session to finish things off. So we are going to be in the company, virtually at least, Cihan Salihugu, who is the director at MasterCard. The subject of his discussion is digital identity and cyber risk in a cashless society.
Hello, everyone. I am Cihan Salioğlu. I would love to be there with you all today, but due to high volume of visa applications and relatively low processing power, I couldn't complete my visa process in time. And I was looking forward to this because it was going to be my first business travel in 20 months. Anyways, let me quickly introduce myself. I am Cihan. I am currently working as a cybersecurity subject matter expert at MasterCard. I'm based out of Istanbul, Turkey, and I have a global role, but I'm mostly taking care of projects in the Europe region. And before joining MasterCard about 1.5 years ago, I was leading PwC cybersecurity and data protection practice. I did that for 2 years. And before that, I was with Deloitte for 11 years in cyber risk services in Istanbul and New York offices. Today, I will be talking about digital identity and cyber resilience in a cashless smart society. I picked that topic because smart cities and digital identity are the two hot topics that I've been reading, thinking, and writing about a lot lately. Without further ado, let's start with the concept of a city and how it actually evolved in time. So these are the two cities you see on the screen are from my two favorite places. One on the left is Istanbul. It's actually a representation of Istanbul from 14th century, from the time when it was the capital of Eastern Roman Empire. The other one is a picture from Czech Republic. If you are looking for a weekend getaway in a historic and well-preserved city, Prague is totally worth considering, my suggestion. Anyways, if we take a look at this history of urbanization and development of cities, we see that people need a safe location to trade goods, exchange ideas, and socialize. Back in the old days, cities or towns were surrounded by high walls and governed by a set of rules, so the people could socialize and conduct trade in an environment protected from external threats. We as human beings still need this physical security, that is correct. So cities of the future, smart cities, need to fulfill similar needs. And in addition to that, it also has to provide digital, trusted digital world where people create communities, exchange information, pursue education, and conduct business. Instead of building walls for protection and isolation, just like in the ancient cities, smart cities must build bridges in order to increase interaction for a secure digital economy. But I can hear you're saying, how can opening new doors be achieved while preserving security, right? It's not an easy task. Yeah, I admit it, especially in an ever-evolving digital world. Many cities and local governments are already well into a digital transformation process. The COVID-19 pandemic acted as a catalyst and increased the pace of digitalization in almost all aspects of life. Business and people who already had the digital tools at their disposal to adapt during these turbulent times grew more during pandemic. Students who could switch to remote learning continued their education with no interruptions. And countries with developed e-government and digital public services continued their serving their citizens as before. Once the pandemic is over, digital-ready cities are expected to be able to better withstand the most damaging effects of such crises. And, city governments and cities that are trying to transition into a smart city, they have their own challenges. They have huge challenges. All are concerned about security and privacy, in such a hyper connected digital world. Therefore, cybersecurity and privacy risks need to be managed proactively on a regular basis rather than reactively and on an ad hoc basis. In a digital city, we expect to see myriad devices and sensors interconnected and exchanging vast amount of data every second. Imagine the sheer amount of volume of data traffic and the complexity of networks once 5G networks become widely used. 5G significantly boosts data transmission needs and enables more connected devices, but this also increases the attack surface as well. Given the fact that 21% of the cybersecurity incidents in 2020 took place at public sector, I think it would be fair to say that public sector is already an attractive target for threat actors. In an environment like that, one of the best things to do is keep it simple. Just like Eric Schneier said, complexity is the enemy of security. And I myself, I'm a strong believer in that statement. As new technologies come to life, we have to evolve with our ecosystem. We are no longer part of a finite fourth-party model, but rather an exploding ecosystem with infinite points of vulnerability. We must also safeguard the trust that was present within the fourth-party model and ensure that the same level of consumer trust can exist in a new environment. And, you know, I'm aware of the fact that it's not easy to build such a trust and maintain it. In the early ecosystem, which is prior to 2012, the payments ecosystem was largely comprised of issuers, acquirers, merchants, and consumers, making up the four-party model. Network connections between stakeholders were clearly defined and protected according to industry standards and protocols. Physical acceptance environments reigned prior to digital expansion. The risk of potential widespread, large-scale fraud and cyber attacks was limited. Fraudsters could not easily access well-protected connections in predominantly physical acceptance environments. Individual fraud protections in place for each stakeholder helped to detect the various types of fraud that occurred within the scope of their defined network connections. In the expanding ecosystem, which is from 2012 to 2016, growth in the number of digital merchants and third-party providers saw more constituents entering the ecosystem, increasing the number of undefined connections between stakeholders. Unprotected emerging digital and cyber technologies became fertile breeding grounds for cyber criminals and criminals in general, to be honest. Fraudsters capitalized on digital and cyber growth, exploiting the increasing points of vulnerability in the ecosystem to perpetrate attacks on a way larger scale. Criminals infiltrated weak points in issuer and processor systems, creating duplicate fraudulent accounts used in point-of-sale devices and ATM cash-out type of attacks. In addition, they also manipulated system gaps from maintenance windows and release defects, disabling spend controls and disrupting normal authorization to approve fraudulent transactions. Fraudsters also seized merchant details to establish themselves as seemingly legitimate online merchants. In the evolving ecosystem, while enhancing consumer convenience, the Internet of Things has also led to greater complexity in payments acceptance and processing. An explosion of digital players, applications, and devices is continually infused into payments ecosystem, creating infinitely more undefined and often inadequately protected connections to other stakeholders. The ecosystem is under perpetual attack of widespread, perpetual threat of widespread attacks as IoT continues to create infinite points of vulnerability. Fraudsters are exploiting the weak links in new IoT systems, applications, and providers that, especially the ones that neglect to utilize stringent network regulatory and security standards and protocols, of course. As a result, all stakeholders are at risk of attack, even those with strong individual fraud protections in place, because the ecosystem is affected. Other than that, I can also give you an example from myself. As a parent, I have a lot of IoT devices at home, such as webcams. I installed them like 7 years ago. And of course, as a cybersecurity professional, the first thing I did was check for vulnerabilities and upgrades, and I updated the firmware of the webcams. But it's been since 7 years since. From time to time, I'm checking for updates, and guess what? No updates. So that's the problem. This is something that needs to be addressed, because IoT devices and SCADA systems are I think it's fair to say that they are the backbone of smart cities, and they need to be well protected. As you can see, identity lies at the heart of everything. There are a number of identities we can see in a digital society. We can see end-user identities, consumer identities, and privileged identities. And definition and the categorization model of all those different types of identities might be different in every organization. I mean, in a smart city, the definition of consumer or citizen identity is pretty straightforward, but the definition of end user and privileged user might be different. In my career, in my advisory career, I was able to serve from Fortune 500 companies to small and medium businesses everywhere in the world. Of course, in some cases, the information my clients were trying to protect were similar, and so were the definition of a privileged user, but some companies had different priorities. I'll give you an example. In a state government client, the crown jewel information can be the routes of trucks that are carrying radioactive residue, whereas a manufacturing client may tag the purchase price of raw material as the most valuable information in the company. I also had a client telling me that their top secret information is the name and address of their supplier in China. I remember I had a very small client with only 6 or 7 employees, but what they were doing was social media management. With only a couple of people, they were managing the social media accounts of multi-million-dollar companies. Can you imagine the risk there? So it is only natural to define different personas as privileged users in different companies and organizations. In a company, database administrator can be the privileged manager, privileged user. In another company, the person who manages social media accounts can be that privileged user. Or the manager sitting in finance department with rights to change the exchange rate information of the accounting and financial reporting systems, that person can be the privileged user. In a smart city, there has to be different tiers of access and categories of identities. All these things should be managed in a centralized way, logged and monitored closely. And when we come to the foundations of a smart city, laying down solid foundations plays a crucial role in building sustainable and digital resilient cities. This is very important. Whatever you're building, especially the smart cities, they need to be digitally resilient, because some of the services that you were providing physically are switching to digital environment, and they need to continue their availability, right? So here are the 4 principles that can be regarded as the four cornerstones of trusted digital cities. So the first one is security and privacy by design. I believe this is very obvious. We must recognize that we have to protect what we build and what we serve. Cybersecurity strategy should be incorporated with the overall strategy of the city. the strategy of the smart city, and every smart city initiative needs to assess its security readiness. They need to evaluate their cybersecurity posture. Ensuring alignment between cybersecurity strategy and the overall goals of the smart city helps stakeholders across the smart city program think of security as an enabler rather than an overhead, because this is what usually happens. Cybersecurity initiatives, all these projects, all these efforts are usually seen as a cost center, and they are considered as an overhead rather an investment. And they need to be seen as investment, and they need to be maintained so. And scalable is the key word if we are serious about building a cashless smart city. We need to build with scalability in mind, and of course, being short in security and privacy measures while growing is a big mistake. This is usually the root cause of large-scale attacks. And in order to avoid that, all services and technology should be built with security and privacy by design and default perspective. So another pillar for us is know yourself. Understanding the problem is the half of the solution, you know. And overall security posture assessment of the smart city is essential while planning the remediation and improvement activities. Cybersecurity is not simply about making technology investments. A holistic approach that allows people, process, and technology to work in harmony is the preferred method of managing cybersecurity resources. And of course, you need to know what is waiting for you outside. Knowing the relevant cybersecurity threats and a threat landscape is one of the best ways to make proper preparation against cyber attacks. Because of that, cyber threat intelligence information is recommended to be incorporated into security strategy of the organization to lead improvement efforts, to guide us along the way. A good strategy can pave your path to victory even when the odds are against you. And our last principle is stay vigilant. Cybersecurity threats are getting more sophisticated, and threat landscape is constantly shifting, right? In this dynamic environment, focusing only on prevention and overlooking on recovery capabilities would be a mistake, because recovering from attacks is as important as defending against cyber threats and reducing the impact of incidents and breaches. Staying vigilant, adapting to ever-changing threats, and being able to recover with minimum impact has become one of the key success factors for endurance in a digital world. Because scalability needs of a city will change over time, agility and adaptability becomes even more of a vital skill set. So in a nutshell, these are the 4 security principles that need to be incorporated in every step of the way as we are designing digital infrastructure of smart cities and smart societies. Adhering to the foundational principles enables digital resilient ecosystem where residents can benefit and business can thrive. Always bear in mind that there is no silver bullet for cybersecurity, and digital resiliency is one of the keys to ensure your cashless smart society maintains an inclusive and sustainable future for all. Being inclusive and sustainable is very important, and you need to have a solid foundation in order to build that infrastructure. I'm not there physically today, so I will not be able to take questions. If you have any questions, please get in touch with me. Do not hesitate to reach out. This is my email address. Thank you for listening. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, we're on to our last session in each other's company. both in person and virtually. I'm going to invite John, Steve, Dan, and Rima onto the stage to get seated. I'll do some proper introductions once we've got settled. Just give us a couple of seconds to do just that. So if you wouldn't mind taking the stage, we'll get ourselves set. Just to say on those, there's a little red button at the bottom. Just press it down for about 2 or 3 seconds. A little red button underneath it, so you just need to press that. Oh, is it done? It's done. Don't press it because you turn it off, right? So I'm giving you exactly the wrong instructions. So let's see how that works. Thanks.
Hello.
Okay, as everyone gets settled, let me just introduce our fantastic panelists for this last session. We're going to talk about the challenges of building a resilient culture. So what does it take to create a robust security environment, and what are the barriers preventing progress? In our company, once again, delighted that John Scott has stayed with us. He is Head of Security Education at the Bank of England. He is closest to me. Next to John is Steve Hill, who's Global Head of Technology, Cyber and Third-Party Risk at Credit Suisse. Next to Steve is Rima Jethwa, who is Insider Security Lead, Chief Information Security Office at Schroders Personal Wealth. And our far side, we have Dan Patefield, who's Head of Program, Cyber and National Security at Tech UK. Let's give them a round of applause. That round of applause is on the condition that it becomes a fascinating debate, and I'm sure it will. One thing I should say about this debate is that we're going to conduct it under Chatham House rule. I'll explain what Chatham House rule is in a second, but just because we want to share as much as possible, we just want to keep this, it's not quite off the record, but it's near as damn it off the record. So Chatham House rule effectively means we can report the mood of the discussion, the direction of this discussion, but what we can't do is attribute anything specific to anybody in particular. I hope that makes sense and that's understood by everybody. So that's Chatham House rule. Let's get on with this. Before we start, I've got a bit of work that I'd like you guys to do, and it's we're going to bring up Slido if we can. I want to start to create a word cloud. The question that we are posing, and some people have taken the time to start to fill this in already, which is fantastic. So what does it take to build a resilient culture? I'm going to put that question or something similar to our panelists in a second. But what does it take to build a resilient culture? So enter some stuff now. You can agree with some of the stuff that's already there. The more people that agree, the bigger the words or the phrases get, just to give you a sense of where we are right now. So we have, in big letters, empathy, time, diversity of backgrounds. They all seem like good things to me, but let's test those. Oh, great. More words coming in. Accountability, understanding, prioritization, teamwork, focus, significant value, accountability and communication. That's fantastic. So what we'll do is we'll leave that on the screen for a couple of seconds. We'll take that off, and then we will revisit it in time. But lots of interesting things there. I can see that word diversity there. Dan, maybe I'll start with you. How would improvements to diversity, talent management, strengthen cyber defenses? Dan, please.
Yeah, thanks, John, and good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll probably focus on this question throughout, but I'd take the question in 2 parts, I think. It's a timely event today to talk about diversity because NCSC released their Decrypting Diversity report for the 2nd time yesterday. I think I'm sure you're all going to go away and read it after this, but I'll kind of summarize it as cautiously optimistic about we're seeing slow improvement in terms of building diversity. And I think one really important thing they've done this year is building out the scope of the document from just focusing on gender diversity and ethnic minorities and broadening it out across people with disabilities, people with neurodiverse conditions and that kind of thing. And that's really important because I think in the past we've tended to look at it as a bit of a numbers game and think, if we get to a certain percentage or a certain number, we'll solve the problem. And it's not really how it works because obviously, if you get people in at a certain level, you still need them to be on leadership teams and things like that. And ultimately, a cynical organisation might look at diversity and think, we don't really need that. We're doing all right. So actually, you've got to show those organisations how diversity impacts bottom line. And you do that by showing that diverse teams make better decisions. People with different perspectives think differently, communicate differently, compute differently. So you've got to solve those problems, and that has a real impact on financial performance, and I think that's the only way that we really solve the problem. Kind of building out to the second point, I think one issue that it identifies in that report is that the workforce isn't as welcoming as it could be, the workplace even. And we've seen some improvements there over COVID as well, because we've moved to home working, we've got better at this hybrid environment that we're testing today. But we've still got a long way to go to make sure that all communities are able to engage in the workforce as well as they could do for the kind of overall good, I suppose. And then we're not going to solve the second part of the question, this kind of bridging the skills gap, without solving that diversity problem. So a few points, if you like, on the skills shortfall.
Dan, hold those there. I'm going to come back to you in a moment, but I wouldn't just mind getting a view from the rest of the panelists before, but remind me if I forget, and I want to hear those. But I just put that diversity question, how does it potentially help strengthen cyber security? Rima, please.
I think having a diverse team brings different ways of thinking, and I think that different way of thinking is needed kind of more than ever in the cyberspace. There's a skills shortage. We need to be thinking innovatively, and I think diversity often people just attribute to gender, but it's to do with age, it's to do with experience, it's to do with disabilities, as you mentioned, Dan.
And is it to do with this word backgrounds as well? Your background, if I'm right, is in accountancy, is that right?
I'm a chartered accountant. I try to keep that quiet. But the fact that I have that experience working in a different environment and my thinking is different, I'm able to bring that different lens and viewpoint into my team now. I'm also not technical. I don't have a computer science degree. And actually, when I interviewed for the role I'm currently in, my manager now, he told me I'm not right for this role, but then he picked out and said, I think there's a role for you here. And the fact that I went in there challenging his thinking, and the fact that I don't understand parts of what discussions are done, I'm able to kind of bring that, can you explain this in layman's terms?
So I was going to ask about transferable skills, and one of those skills is about being able to translate.
Translate and also simplify. And I think it's just so undervalued and often forgotten, because I think at the exec level we're talking about money, we're talking about finances, we're talking about figures, and we often forget that ultimately we're here to think about the people on the ground doing the job. Are we doing what's right for them to enable them to do their job? So I think that diversity is really, really important. And I think from a security perspective, it's also just branching out. Security is everyone's responsibility, not just the information security team. So if we remember that and what we're trying to do, the front line understand, even if you don't have that diverse pool within your security team, you can bring in that diversity by just branching out into the business.
At the moment, thank you very much indeed. Steve, for the want of violently disagreeing or violently agreeing, perhaps, I mean, is there anything you would say differently than what you've heard just now from both Rima and Dan in terms of the role of diversity?
No. Well, first of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to be in real life here. I listened to some of these previous, and it feels like everybody spent a lot of time preparing for these presentations. I came from government into the financial sector 4 or 5 years ago, and one of the things that struck me was the degree to which that sort of independent challenge was built into with the 3 lines of defense. And that's a really kind of powerful vindication of having different perspectives. But it's massively undermined if the people sitting in those jobs all come from the same background with the same perspective and the same culture. And to me, it's clear that there's an ethical case, and it's also clear that there's a business case around taking better decisions if you don't allow yourself to sink into groupthink. I think where the challenge is it's often easier for us as we're appointing people and growing our teams to look for more of the things that we're familiar with. And it's forcing yourself into that hard decision, exactly the example that you gave, Rima, that is the hump that we have to get over.
So do we need, for example, when we are acquiring talent, to have gender-blind CVs, for example? How do we do this in practice?
I mean, I already see a degree of that happening where, in terms of the candidates that you bring on, in terms of having policies whereby having females on recruitment boards and so on, it's moving us in the right direction. But it will take that time to shift the culture so that people actually think it's not an imposition, it's actually something which is a clear value add to expand your base and the perspectives. I mean, I'm hardly a poster child for diversity, but to some degree in a sort of intellectual diversity sense, bringing me on as someone who is not like yourself, deeply technical, who didn't come from the financial sector, but was brought in to look at cyber risk from someone who had dealt with terrorism and proliferation and those kind of government issues. You bring a different perspective, and that challenge, I think, is helpful. And the more that people see that by taking those chances, they arrive at better solutions, then it becomes self-reinforcing, and that's where we've got to get to.
Very good, Steve. Thank you for the moment. John, your perspective on this, please.
So I'm not going to disagree with anything that anybody said, but I'd like to take it a step further. It's absolutely fantastic bringing in diverse opinions and so on. Let's stop beating everybody into the same square-pegged hole once they're in the job. Because diversity, one of the ways that you can see diversity is diversity of language, for example. And I think I qualified as a librarian, so again, not a technical background. I think one of the things that surprised me when I moved into cybersecurity was quite how military the language was. We talk about cyber kill chains and red teams and blue teams and penetration tests. Really? And what we're doing is we are encouraging groupthink. We are taking a view that there is this great persistent threat out there. 95% of what causes a breach is an accident. You know, if we took a safety language, or if we took a diversity language, a better communications, we would think about cybersecurity differently. And the fact that a lot of organizations don't means that as you bring in your diverse workforce, you bring in your non-technical workforce, you bring in more women, you bring in more people from ethnic backgrounds, if we're forcing them to think the same way as us, are we really actually looking at diversity at all?
Very good. Before we'll probably take this off the screen shortly, but before we do, I just want to get people's thoughts, whether you're surprised. I'll start with you, John, whether anything on this list surprises you, or the absence of anything on this list surprises you. Let me just sort of read some of this out again. So that diversity of background seems to be the biggest one at the moment. Around it, we've got time, we've got communication, we've got focus, we've got empathy. Then some other words here: listen, understanding, trust, teamwork. There's some themes emerging here. Diversity of perspectives, slightly different from diversity of backgrounds, of course. Opportunity for juniors, ability to learn, accountability, team culture, significant value on IT. I think that's the people. Collaboration, prioritization, and again, the people. Anything on that list surprise you in terms of the weight it's given or in terms of its presence there?
No, I think the list is really, really key. I think there's one thing I'd add to it, which is testing. I was speaking with someone from another financial institution, and he made the very wise observation that if you could have a system that's got 99.999% uptime. That isn't a resilient system, that's a persistent system. They're not the same thing. So the one thing I would say...
Just forgive me, tease out the difference between those two things?
If something is up all the time, how do you know it's going to come back when it falls over? That's as simple as that. It's persistent, fantastic. You've got 100% uptime, great. then what? Because if you haven't tested it, if you haven't said, what happens when we switch off the connection to Swift, for example? How long can we keep going? Swift is really resilient. It's a great system. But what happens when we've no longer got access to it? Because there may be something, that black swan event, that means that it happens. Then what? And I think one of the real key things, all of those things are fantastic. I think they're really, really key points, especially given my background. But one of the things that isn't mentioned on there is, what next?
Very good. Others, Steve, anybody else? If there isn't anything that you're struck by, that's fine. We'll move on. I want to talk about best practice in a second. But anything on that list?
Yeah, to me, the omission there is really following up what John said, which is around inclusion. So this is focusing, if you like, on onboarding and bringing people with the right background, but then keeping them and making them flourish in different ways, I think is an equal challenge.
Very good. Rima?
I echo that. I think inclusivity, we get them in, we get them through the door. Do they feel like they can be themselves in the workplace? And can they continue to do that? Otherwise, the USP that they came in with is going to disappear. And I think that's even
Just out of
more
interest, has that
important.
become easier, more difficult in a time of pandemic, in a time of hybrid working?
Very difficult. Very, very difficult. There's opportunities there for managers to tap into people's home lives, but I just don't think that lens was brought in enough, because ultimately we are talking to people in their homes with their kids, with their families, and the barriers are broken down more than ever before. So the opportunity has been there for us to allow that inclusivity to kind of go up to that next level. Has it been done, and have we maximized it? And I think it's something to focus on that much more as we kind of move into the hybrid working world. Yeah.
Thank you. Dan, anything on that list that's...
I think I'd echo the retention point, really. And I think cyber's a sphere where people can quite often easily move jobs every 12, 18 months if they want to. So keeping hold of staff is actually a real challenge, and one that probably, so my organisation works across all sectors, but financial services probably does that slightly better than some others.
Does it slightly better?
Absolutely, yeah.
I don't know why there was surprise in my voice, but that's your...
Yeah, no, that definitely. I mean, part of it might be that the salary is slightly better, but the kind of talent drains to where the money is, I suppose.
Very good. I think we'll take that off the screen for the moment, because what I'd like to encourage is some questions from you. I've got some more questions, you've got better questions, so get writing questions on Slido as they occur to you, and we'll come to those sooner rather than later. But Dan, earlier on I cut you off in your prime. You, I think, going to share 3 things with us, so please.
No, I think the only point I'd kind of say, moving on to that kind of skill shortfall piece, is that I think we sometimes conflate the issue. So sometimes we look at that in the round, when really we're looking at a number of different problems. We're looking at kind of cyber security profession, roles that need real cyber security professionals in them, with certifications, whether it be in incident management, whatever it is. And then on the other side of that, the kind of general core skills we need in the whole workforce that, is that level of cyber hygiene that everyone needs. I think we probably might talk about how different sections of society are engaged at different levels in cyber. So, some areas we care about it in this room. Obviously, everyone's got some level of cyber interest, but the average person on the street really doesn't. So how do we make those people take an interest, and that obviously benefits us all in terms of the kind of first line of defence, if you like.
Very good, which leads me nicely into the next question I wanted to ask. And John, I'll start with you on this one. What steps need to be taken to embed best practice into everyday workflows?
Well, I mean, you just wave a magic wand, right? And it all happens. I think some of that is very organisational dependent, but broadly speaking, I think there's starting to have a maturity about risk conversations. So, I think your point about everybody needs some degree of cyber hygiene. What degree is it? If I'm working on my own device at home, that's a different circumstance than if I'm plugged into my core network at work on a bank laptop that's locked down to, between here and Sunday. So what are those situations, and what do we actually understand by those situations? Because I think one of the things, and I'll talk about security education, security awareness specifically. But one of the things people want is certainty. They want to say, just give me a list of yeses, a list of nos, I'll do the yeses, I won't do the nos, and then I'm safe, right? And we all know that that's not the case. So I think it's a real challenge, and this is part of resilient culture for me, but is getting everybody to understand that risk is not constant, that there are times when it's okay to take a little bit of risk. In fact, it's times when it's very encouraged to take a bit of risk, and security should support that. And there are times, maybe you're working with more sensitive data, maybe there's regulatory oversight, maybe there's legal reasons, whatever it is, there's times where you need to be more careful. And getting people to understand that sometimes making the least worst decision is the right thing to do. You know, there isn't a good answer here. What did you think through? Did you try and do the least damage to the organization that you could? And that's okay. You did the best thing you could in those circumstances. So I think it's broadly that. It's, if I could say one thing, it's get people used to, rather than talking about security, get them used to talking about risk. And how does security support risk?
And you're incredibly persuasive. When you say least worst option, it sounds very convincing, and I'm convinced sitting next to you. But I wonder, you know, certain organizations, that's not going to go down so well.
I mean, least worst option for that organization. But there is going to, you know, if we really want a resilient culture, that means everybody has to buy into it. Everybody has to do the best that they can in that circumstance, in that moment. And, you know, it's like if you have a car accident. If you have a no-fault accident and you agree between yourselves, and yes, you will exchange insurance details and so on, that's it. That's great. You've come to that. If you're not at fault and you drive off, you're the one who faces criminal charges for leaving the scene of an accident, even though the other person drove into you. It's trying to get people to understand that situations are situational. They have to be. Security has to be situational. And if an organization doesn't have that flexibility, then they need to make that clear. You have to do exactly the right thing. But you won't get a resilient culture that way. You'll get a compliant culture. And that's not a bad thing in some circumstances, but it will kill you in others.
That feels important. Not a resilient culture, but a compliant culture. Steve, the same question to you, please, about embedding best practice into everyday workflows. And in the spirit of Chatham House, maybe there's some thoughts and ideas that you can share in terms of what you're doing in-house. Or maybe not.
I mean, I suspect that we're not doing hugely different things from what other people are doing. I'm not sure I wholly agree with the idea that persuading people that this is important is the major challenge. I mean, I'm a great fan of that Peter Drucker quote that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and that if you build the right culture, the rest will flow. And so investment in training and awareness and building that culture, to my mind, gives you much bigger bang for buck than yet another kind of Gucci technical tool that will stop some specific attack or whatever. But for me, measuring it is a really big challenge. And certainly working in a financial institution, your argument is much stronger if you are able to demonstrate progress in terms of risk reduction from work that you've done. And I think that's much trickier when you're talking about culture than when you're talking about practical technical measures, like eliminating end of service life or something like that. There will be very clear, concrete figures that everyone can understand. But for me, the challenge, I think, is maybe 5 or 10 years ago, there was a sense that boards didn't really get it. They delegated cybersecurity to their IT professionals and moved on to their kind of what they saw as their core business. I don't think that's the case now.
That's not the case anymore.
I don't think so. Nor do I think it's the case even that boards don't really know what they should be doing. I think that the education has progressed in the last, since I joined the financial sector, certainly, that the understanding of those basic proper measures that need to be taken, I think that's it. I think the challenge now is doing it and prioritizing it and moving at sufficient speed. So if you look at the UK National Resilience Strategy and the risk register of the UK, we had pandemics on it. We'd identified it as one of our top national risks as something that would happen. We'd also sort of worked out the things that we needed to do to mitigate the impact. But we didn't do it. And of course, what tends to happen is that you need to have that big dramatic event like 9/11 to then spend the billions or trillions that you then spend on countering terrorism. Similarly, I think there's been a series of false dawns in cybersecurity, 2017 with WannaCry Not Petya, more recently in the US with the Colonial pipeline, Microsoft and so on, where there's a sort of flurry of, is this the moment where suddenly that investment begins to really materialize?
Just out of interest, can you feel that in-house? Can you feel that as soon as an event like that happens? And I remember the Talk event way back when, and Dido Harding going up on and not necessarily answering the questions the way that she might have done, and that was seen as an ability to focus minds on those that mattered. Is that the reality, that helps to make the argument and to make change?
I think on balance it helps, but it also runs the risk that it takes you off a strategic direction, because if it happens to have been a major DDoS attack, or it happens to have been a particular type of attack vector, or it's been an insider, then there can be like sort of 5 or 6 year olds playing football. Everybody can kind of run towards that ball. And unlike, I was at the Chelsea match last night where you saw two teams really keeping their shape. And that's where it becomes more tricky at board level, is if actually the headlines, instead of simply bolstering the messages that they're being fed up by senior executives, can sort of take the conversation off course and take investment off course, because it's like we must absolutely fix this problem that I read about in the Daily Mail or the Financial Times yesterday, rather than we've got a strategic direction and that's one, but it may not be the top one.
Steve, that's really interesting. Thank you very much indeed. Again, it's the same question about best practice. Rima, please.
Best practice is such a loosely used term. And I think with security education, it's really important to understand that people are there to do a job, and this is something extra we're adding onto their plate. So my ethos is how can we make it easy, fun, almost turn it into a bit of a break for them, make it useful for them so that it's not them learning buzzwords and really complicated terminology that they don't understand, that they're going to then have to take another 10 minutes scratching their heads about. How can we make it relatable that they can use outside of work?
So how they sound like good words, easy and fun. How do you do that in-house?
Firstly, you've got to have, from the top, you've got to give the permission to think a bit differently and take risks. And I've been lucky enough to be able to do that. So one of the first things I did was, we're living in an Instagram, TikTok generation. People will deny that they're not on Instagram or TikTok, but when they go home with their kids, their families, their parents, this is the stuff that engages them. This is what captures their attention. So how can we bring it into the workplace in a formal way? And it was videos that I pushed out first, and I thought, what better way to kind of make a statement than have animated videos once a month. Some people liked it, some people didn't. We've got 60% viewing rates, and people like it. It's 4 minutes of a video once a month. There's a bit of a story, it brings it to life, and there's a few key takeaways from that. People then talk, people take it home, you'll discuss it at the dinner table with your children, your parents, your partners, and slowly, I think that's where you keep doing that, and how you can keep enabling people to come back for more. We've got this other series that we've pushed out. It's called The Inside Man. It's like a Netflix-style series. Every week we've got 10 minutes of a break. We've got a bit of a cult-like following now. They want to watch it. 1 week I actually forgot to push it out, and I had 15 people email me in the morning saying, why hasn't it come out? Which is great. And
just for the uninitiated, The Inside Man, it's called. This is a sort of a drama around.
It's a drama. It's Twist and Shout, produced by Twist and Shout. It's a Know Before company. It's 10 minutes. It's honestly like a Netflix-style series. I think I'm now advertising for them. It was on Amazon Prime last year. They've taken it down, but it's great. It's a series. There's a storyline behind it, and I think every episode has key takeaways. Make sure you think about plugging a USB into it that someone has just given to you. Make sure you think before you click on an email before it comes through. And it's all very real life, relatable examples that they're taking away.
Forgive me, and Dan, I'll come to you in a second for some thoughts on best practice as well, but not to take all the fun out of it. But do you know that it's having the desired effect, to the word that Steve used in terms of measure? Are you able to measure the success or otherwise?
Because then we measure it against, we look at the viewing rates, and then we can directly correlate it to, have we seen an increase in reporting rates for the phishing testing that we do, and have we seen a decrease in the click rates? And actually we're building that picture. It is very difficult. It does take time. It's been a year, and only now are we starting to get some of those insights through, but it's building that picture. And then there's other tools that we look at. You know, are these people engaging in more training? And if they've clicked on a phishing test, are they then doing their remedial training? Do they care enough that they want to follow up and do additional training? And I think in terms of best practice, to that point, it's making the security team accessible. We're not, you know, the police. We're not gonna. It's the carrot versus the stick approach. If you've done something wrong, it's okay. Be vulnerable. Own up to it. We're not gonna cut your bonus. We don't have that power. But it's just making it accessible. And if someone's unsure, they want to come and ask you. And it's just building that trust. And just one more thing really quickly, which has been really successful for us, is the Champions Network. People are more likely to listen to a trusted colleague and spend 5 minutes doing what they've said, rather than it being mandated to you by the security team. So if you can build a strong Champions Network and call it something other than Champions Network, because people don't like that word, you'll build.
How does that work in practice? Is that informal? Is that formal? How does it work?
I've tried to keep it as informal as possible. If you want to join. You'll get lots of freebies. We'll do fun stuff.
You're hearing from your peers, are you?
Yeah, exactly. From any level too. It doesn't have to be a specific level or seniority. And that way, they're getting something out of it, in the sense they're learning. They can then feed it back. There's obvious benefits to participating in extra work outside of your day job, and they have more of a voice than sometimes we do.
But you're looking for another title rather than Champions Network. So if anyone's got a suggestion, they should put it onto Slido. Right?
Definitely,
Very
please.
good, very good. Dan, the same question to you, and then we'll go out and we'll take some questions from the audiences.
Sure, I think the measuring point's exactly right. I think, you know, there's so many products out there for cybersecurity, whether it's in this space or it's in technological areas, whatever. So if you can measure it, you can see if it's working. And essentially, for awareness, you've got to speak to people how they want to be spoken to. So if you see it's not working, there's definitely something else you can do. I want to pick up on the kind of broader CISO function point, really, and talk a little bit about the kind of golden triangle, if you like, between process, people, and technology. And any successful mitigation is based on all three of those things rather than one. And quite often, companies are good at one or two, but not all three. And it's the three that makes the culture. And the CISO function, we did a bit of work at the start of the year that we're looking at, you know, are the right skills in there quite often enough. And again, financial services is an area where it's probably further on than a few other sectors. But it's not just about technical skill, it's exactly about those communication skills. That function's got to drive interest, compliance, engagement throughout the business. So you've got to really bring those skills in that are the classic, you know, technical cyber roles, if you're going to make a dent in that culture thing. And the last point there is that, you know, you don't get a culture. You don't end and think, oh, we've done it now. It's constantly renewing. The threat's always changing. So you've got to constantly change what you're doing to keep it going, if that makes sense.
And in your... Please, John, please.
I just want to come back on the people, process, technology point, because I think you're right, but they're not equal. And that's one of the really key things for me. So if you look at password management, for example, we make that a technological fix. You cannot change your password to one that does not match our password policy if you've got a good system. If you're enforcing complexity, it will check and see that you've got complexity. If you're enforcing length, it will check and see if you've got length. We take that decision out of the end user's hands because we think it's important. Now, whether we do that rightly or wrongly is a different matter. But I think, so while I agree with you, I think one of the things that we can do is we can look at those interactions and we can actually say, when is it important that technology leads on this? When is it important that people lead on it? And the more uncertain it gets, the more we need those judgment calls, that's when it's more important that we let the person lead. So great, we can define a password policy. We can define all these other technologically coded things. And what that does is it takes the cognitive burden off of our staff to allow them to apply judgment. So, you know, my point earlier about having that much more mature risk-based conversation in the right places. In the place where we don't have a hard policy, where we have to rely on judgment, we have to then trust the people to use their judgment. We have to encourage them and support them in using their judgment. And when they get it wrong, we have to acknowledge that. So absolutely agree with that triad. But I think remembering that if you draw it as a triangle, at some point you will be at much closer to one point of the triangle than to one of the other two.
Dan, do you want to come back on that?
No, completely agree.
Very good, Steve.
I will add one point. I mean, and taking your picture of the car, I think there's a really interesting, if you like, analogy with airbags and with seatbelts and smoking in cars and using devices. And you see in some cases, I think where we're most successful is where nobody has to switch on their airbag in order to have a safer journey. We do have to put on a seatbelt physically, but actually culturally, if you like, that message. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, more often than not, you wouldn't wear a seatbelt. I think there's now an interesting inflection point. I was in New York last week where in taxis and so on, you have to wear a seatbelt in the back seat as well as the front seat, where you could see most people were still not doing that, and that cultural shift is still happening. And that's the point that I think you're making, which is that we get to the point where the technology, I guess it's cybersecurity by design or resilience by design, that thinking that came up in the previous presentation, that's where we're trying to get to, where we sort of take the burden away from people. They welcome the fact that it's been taken away from them. And where they do have something of a burden, like putting on a seatbelt, it's not overly onerous. They see the point of it. They see the kind of risk equation, and now they will do it.
And that takes us back to culture, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely right. And it's seeing that it's justified. None of us would really want to put on the fireproof suit, the 5-point harness, the helmet to get into the car to go to the supermarket, right? We don't see the risk there. Maybe we should, but we don't. But if we were an F1 driver, we would go, this is the bare minimum of protection I want before going in this small tin can that drives at 200 miles an hour. So yeah, absolutely agree. I think what we're trying to do is make sure that when people have to make those decisions, they understand that they're in their best interests, that they've bought into them, and that they are reasonable.
Let's go to questions. Nadia, do we have any questions on Slido? There's a nodding head, which is good news, so we'll just take a second for those to come up. If they don't come up, we're going to extend the driving analogy until it breaks very badly. Okay, fantastic stuff. So I'm just going to take these in order. The question from Matthew. IBM has created a quantum processor capable of processing at a level of complexity that can't be done on a traditional computer. How will QC impact res and sec? I'm struggling with res, but sec. Resilience, thank you very much. Resilience and security, thank you. Who would like to take that one first? Thoughts on that? John, any thoughts?
I mean, we're already seeing post-quantum cryptography being developed as a discipline. So I think it's just another arms race. It may well be that, for those of you who've done the maths, it may be that quantum computing solves the P versus NP problem and all of our cryptography dies. Maybe. But that's a space that people are already working on. So I think it will change the space, but any tool which can be used for attack can be used for defense.
Anybody else got thoughts on that? Otherwise, I will move on to the next question. Steve.
I think it's a tomorrow problem. I think that it is something that we should begin to think about, and certainly if you talk of some of the kind of government agencies, they are beginning to address it. But for most of us, our confidential information is actually fairly perishable. the ability of someone in 5 or 10 years to be able to decrypt it the impact of that will be limited. And so it feels to me that we're still struggling with today's problems and we haven't cracked those. And so, yes, we should begin to think about quantum computing and the implications it may have. But I think there are higher priorities.
Very good. Thank you very much. And let's take the second question from Abdul. And I'll start, if that's okay with you, Rima, and get Dan's view on this. How do you deal with the imposter syndrome when you join a cybersecurity team? How do you bring real and tangible value as recognized by the experts or people from cybersecurity field? So this idea of the imposter syndrome, if I understand it correctly, that's sort of that sense that you're kind of, you don't have the skills to be there and you're busking it, for want of a better term.
That's such a good question. I often face this. How do I deal with it? I don't know. I think it's how you deal with anything. I think if you truly believe that you're adding value, if you truly believe you understand a problem and you have a solution for it, I think it's to do with a bit of confidence, and it's to do with you just have to believe in what you do and the value that you're adding.
I wonder if one of the things is, and one of the things you're taught as a journalist is to ask the dumb questions and to get people to explain what res and sec means when you don't know what it means. And it's okay to ask those questions. Is that part of it?
100% agree. And I think that's something I've brought to my team, for example, because I am that non-technical person coming into a team full of very technical people, is just ask those questions. And I think, if anything, it may be in a cybersecurity team, it's that much easier because there are those technical words and buzzwords still being used that often people around the table who've been in it for years still don't quite understand themselves. It's coming back to the point of risk. Do people really understand what risk is, even those professionals who work in risk? So just ask the question, having that confidence, and I think over time, just like with anyone else in cybersecurity or not, just fake it till you make it, I guess.
Dan, thoughts on imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I think obviously everyone has their own little insecurities and those kind of things that they've got to crack on with. But I think I'd turn the question around and put it on the organisation. The report I mentioned right at the start goes really hard on how, ultimately the businesses have got to do this. They've got to make it an environment where we can all talk and engage about cyber, whether we're in a technical role or not. So I think, it's not over time, if every organisation gets a little bit better at that, we all as a whole do. But yeah, that's all I'd say to that.
It's a good question. Everyone's got to have a bite at this. Steve, imposter syndrome.
Well, first of all, I'm glad that you recognise that it wasn't just Credit Suisse being singled out here in the question. I think it's about broader. It almost comes back to our initial discussion about diversity. We're all bringing different things to the table, and it's about how you best leverage and actually strike a balance across a team so that everybody, some of my team members are petrified about going and presenting to a board and deeply uncomfortable about doing that. But they have a depth of knowledge which, based on decades of experience, which I can never hope to match. And you mustn't try and match that. But if you can sit around, then it is that thing where the sum is greater than the individual parts.
Very good. John, please.
I was going to make the exact point that I think has been made. As much of this is on the people in the team as it is on the individual, because when it comes down to it, if I'm running a meeting and I've brought 10 people into the room, I think they've all got value. Otherwise, they're not going to be there. They're wasting time. I'm wasting their time. They're wasting mine. They're wasting the team's. So that's my job as that facilitator then, to go around and say, well, actually, I want the business. I won't say the naive. I'll say I want the business view on this. How is this going to get across? Are we explaining it the right way? And if I've got someone, I think one of the things that the pandemic has really, really driven home to a lot of us is how difficult it is to facilitate and to actively manage those sorts of discussions. I mean, you're doing a great job here, thank you very much. But it's a skill. And I think that one of the things that the way we deal with imposter syndrome is we say, well, most people aren't imposters, but we might not be seeing their best. And what do we as the organisation do to make sure that we do see their best, that we give them that opportunity? If it's as simple as I'm sorry, John, you've talked enough now. Can you shut up so we can hear from someone else? If that's the appropriate way to say it. But, you know, it's making space for people. And, you know, some people, I can just talk their hind leg off a donkey. That's one of my skill sets. Other people might need a few seconds to say, I need to think about the answer before I start speaking, please. Well, let's make sure that we know that and that we give them space.
I was about to tell you to shut up. I'm not going to do that more. It's too late, isn't it? We've got a couple more questions. And again, I think this question in terms of, you know, if you're, we'll take Adil's question first. And if you've got nothing to contribute, we'll move on because we've got 2 questions and there's a question I want to ask as well. How do you bridge the gap between financial regulation and IT's understanding and their role? For example, they're generally weak on documentation policies, monitoring reports. So that gap between financial regulations and IT's understanding. Anyone got a thought on that question? It's okay not to have them, as we've just established. It's okay not to have a thought on that. But if you have...
Very, very briefly, do IT understand the impact of not having them? Because again, if they're just being told, you need to have this report, you need to have this policy, we need to see this documentation, okay, that's not a priority. Actually need to have it because we might be subject to a 20 million euro fine. Now suddenly it's a little bit more interesting, right? So I think it's having those much more open conversations about why am I asking you for this stuff?
Very good. Excellent. Let's move on to Matthew's question. In your views, what are firms currently missing around resilience culture and where should we increase focus for greatest impact? So anything, Dan, anything missing in terms of firms when it comes to resilience culture?
I suppose an area where I'd say we can make real improvement is in procuring the right things. You know, mentioned earlier, it's a really busy space in terms of the products that are out there. You know, I think none of the companies that have spoke today are guilty of this, but it's a really busy marketing space that say, you know, this is a silver bullet. It never is. Technology is only as good as the choices it enables or the people it enables. So understanding and improving that link between, you know, you're buying this for what reason, what's the measurable outcome, is I think the bit which could really unlock more value for us all.
Very good. Rima, anything missing?
Just echoing everything we've discussed, all the other questions, and I think resilient culture is also you yourself understanding what roles and skills you need. We don't know what we don't know, so sometimes actually taking that time to just brainstorm and yes, we need a security architect, yes, we need a GRC person, yes, we need an insider risk person. Just stepping back and what's our skills gap and actually what type of skill set, what type of person do we need, and also just taking that time to think about what we don't know and what we don't know, what we don't need. We don't know what we don't need. We don't know what we need.
Got it. I've got it. Thank you. Steve, please.
So I think I'd answer it a little bit differently. I think we've seen peak cybersecurity, and I think that the paradigm shift to resilience is massive, and I think it's a whole different way of thinking. This assuming control failure, assuming the severe events, moving the focus in kind of NIST terms from the prevention side to the recovery side. To some degree, for me, it's an admission of the fact that we've sort of lost the battle on stopping bad stuff happening. The earlier ransomware presentations I thought were excellent. What I would take from it is the fact that, and I guess it also comes back to your point on the training and culture, that, you know, the sort of no blame approach, because a determined adversary will succeed. They're more agile than us, they're quicker, they're working from places that we can't get to. It's not going to go away. The battle to limit the blast radius when the bad thing happens, I think, is still in play, but it takes a huge shift of board senior management thinking to sort of move from a perimeter defense approach of, you know, let's buy more and more tools to boost our kind of perimeter defense, to acknowledging and accepting that there are no perimeters now. Third-party piece, you just can't say, even defining an insider, you can't even define them anymore. And so I think that there is a massive, significant strategic shift that needs to take place towards this culture of resilience, and that's different from security.
Very good. Thank you very much, John.
I think the key thing for me is that resilience is a marathon, not a sprint. If I give you an example, a friend of mine was the EMEA CISO for Equifax at the time they had their breach. So it happened in the North American estate. He makes it very clear. But he said two things. He said there was, unrelated to the breach, outside their Canadian office, there was a shooting in the street. Not an employee or anything like that. But the HR teams were all over it. They made sure that counselling was available if anybody had been affected by it. They made sure that they did their business management processes to make sure that nobody had been, that was their employee, and so on. There was this blanket of care went around them because something bad had happened near them. At the same time, my friend had a team who were working 20-hour days for 8 weeks to try and contain the breach. Ultimately, and very, very sadly, one member of his team in Australia ended up committing suicide over the issue. Now, that's horrible. That's a real human cost of a breach. Somebody was so overwhelmed by it that they took their life. How do we protect our teams from that? How do we stop them working 20-hour days for 8 weeks, 9 weeks, 10 weeks? Because that's the sort of timescales we might be talking about to really make sure that ransomware isn't on our estate anymore, that our data isn't at risk, that our customers aren't at risk. So how do we actually shift the understanding of the organization that these things aren't one-off events, but they might have implications on our teams, on their mental well-being, on their physical well-being that go on for months at a time? And until we start having those conversations, I'm sorry, it's a very shocking thing to talk about suicide, but until we start talking about those things and say this is a direct outcome of a breach, then I don't think our organizations are really taking it seriously enough.
John, thanks very much indeed. I've got one more question. I saw there was a question from Deepak. Forgive me, it took a day and a half before the metaverse came up in this conference, which I was surprised. That's quite a while to wait. Grab one of these guys afterwards and ask that very question, but I'm going to steal the last minutes we have together to ask a question across the panel. John, I'll start with you, and brief answers if you wouldn't mind. But I just want to return to our title, The Challenges of Building a Resilient Culture. So one piece of advice, it may be something you've mentioned already, but just leave the people here, the people at home with one piece of advice when it comes to building a resilient culture. John, please.
Talk to your staff.
Brief, excellent. Steve, please.
I agree with John.
Just think differently. Speak to people outside the organization. Just find out what the kids are doing these days, and just keep thinking outside the box.
Very much, Dan, please.
And trying to end on a positive note, I'd say resilience is absolutely right, but we also need to talk about how all the transformation we're seeing is enabled by cybersecurity.
Great stuff. Thank you all for your questions. Really great as usual. Please join me in thanking the panel. And as they make their way off this lovely stage, I'm going to wrap up. We are pretty much there. We have lunch and networking outside for those of you in the room, which is not to be sniffed at. We also have a draw, don't we? So I'm going to do this draw. This is for and you're going to have to, it's for a MacBook Air. Very good. Excellent. And I'm going to put my hand in this bucket and pull out a name. It's one of our speakers, Chris Morgan. Very good. Chris, are you still in the room? Fantastic. Come on. Chris, you've got to come over and collect your gold envelope, I'm afraid.
Well, that sorts my wife's Christmas present, so
Very good.
Thank you
Excellent.
so much.
Fantastic. Very excellent stuff.
Thank you.
Cheers. Good. It's good to end on a high. That's fantastic. Thank you all so much for your attendance. Really appreciate it. I think a really interesting day and a half in each other's company. I'm going to do one more thing before we leave each other and before we have lunch out there. Two more things. One is to thank you one more time. Thank everybody out there who dialed in virtually to be part of this. And I'm going to spend just a few seconds thanking our sponsors. Mimecast, Xero, Fox, Broadcom, Proofpoint, Synopsys, BlackBerry, Fortinet, Trend, Micro, CyberInt, Agari, CyberSprint, Digital Shadows, RevBits, and Tessian. Thank you all very much indeed. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you.